Greetings, science fiction and fantasy enthusiasts. Do you read books? Do you watch films? Do you hate deodorant? Then welcome to our podcast. You're listening to No Deodorant in Outer Space with Ryan Sean O'Reilly. Now, let's get started.
I keep thinking about this river somewhere, with the water moving really fast, and these two people in the water trying to hold on to each other, holding on as hard as they can, but in the end, it's just too much. The current's too strong. They've got to let go, drift apart. That's how it is with us. It's a shame, Kath, because we've loved each other all our lives, but in the end, we can't stay together forever. Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, and welcome to another edition of No Deodorant in Outer Space. My name is Ryan Sean O'Reilly, and I'll be guiding you on this journey as we discuss yet another book and movie in our repertoire here. Joining me on this episode, returning all the way from years gone past, is going to be Daniel Gonzalez.
Hello, Ryan. Thanks for having me again.
Dan, how are you doing this evening?
I'm doing pretty well. Hanging here in downtown Chicago, enjoying the skyline.
Yeah, we're up in a skyscraper in the middle of the city. I think we're in the Gold Coast, I believe. No, we're not in the Gold Coast. Streeterville. We're in Streeterville. I don't even know where we are, and I live just outside the city. But we're right in the middle of the city, and you can hear the city bustling in the background. Dan, you joined us previously. I think you were on The Martian, right?
I was. Yeah.
So now you're joining us once again.
Yeah, thanks for having me again. I'm excited to talk about the book.
Yeah, welcome back. Just so the audience can re-familiarize themselves to you a little bit, you were on the Martian episode. What's your background with media and science fiction, fantasy, horror? Do you have any favorite books or movies that speak to you more in those areas?
You know, if anyone ever asks me what science fiction I like, I always say that I like Harry Potter.
Oh yeah,
but I'm not sure if that's really science fiction
it's more
or that's fantasy than not. But you know, I do a lot of reading, but if I would say science fiction, I would say Harry Potter is probably up there in terms of what I enjoy reading.
Cool. All right, and also on this episode, joining us, we have another special guest. We have Margret O'Reilly. Hello, Margret.
Hello, Ryan.
Margret, you're special on this episode because you've never been on the podcast before. However, you're on every episode of the podcast because you are the voiceover.
I am.
So you introduce every episode and close out every episode.
Yes.
You are my cousin, and so we are related, so you'll have to be nice to me on this recording.
I'll try my best.
In theory.
I love you.
But, so I wanted to ask you the same question I put to Dan, as far as books, literature, movies, do you have anything that you like that's related even loosely to science fiction, fantasy, horror, or those genres? Anything that you can remember even growing up or whatever that speaks to you? What's your background and your association with those genres?
Well, I've always been quite an avid reader. I've through school, etc., throughout my life. Things that I'm very intrigued by are kind of the alternate realities or futures, or in line with what we are discussing today, the dystopian genre, or things like that. I'm interested in archetypal type stories. So in terms of my background being in clinical neuropsychology, thinking about people thematically and visually and artistically and multiple parts.
Do you get into myths and stuff at all? I think the other night we were talking about that
Yes, mythology. I think history often repeats itself, and so when themes and stories from years ago that still hold true across time often.
Cool.
So in essence, mythology, Greek mythology, psychology, fables, things like that are things that I'm quite interested in.
All right, excellent. And in this episode, we're going to be covering the book and movie called Never Let Me Go. The book was written by the author. Let me make sure I pronounced his name correctly.
You're going to get it right there.
Yeah, let me make sure I pronounce it correctly. His name is Kazuo Ishiguro, I believe. And the book came out in, let me look at my notes here. The book came out from Faber and Faber in 2005, and we're also going to talk about the movie, which was directed by Mark Romanek, and the movie came out...
I thought it was Romanov.
I think you thought wrong. I'm sorry.
Probably.
And the movie came out in 2010 starring Keira Knightley. So we're going to talk about Never Let Me Go. That's the bottom line. So to get things going, we'll talk about the author, of course. Let me get into that. Kazuo Ishiguro was born November 8th, 1954. He's still alive as of the date of this recording. He was born in Nagasaki, Japan. His family moved to England in 1960 when he was just like 5 years old. His father was a physical oceanographer, which studies the processes of the ocean. And his mother, interestingly enough, was in Nagasaki when the atomic bomb hit. And I believe she suffered some injuries when that hit. Kazuo, he talks about his Japanese heritage, and the way he distinguishes it is his family immigrated to England, but for a long time, I forget what age, they were always under the impression they were going to go back to Japan. So the family was always studying Japanese culture and keeping in touch with that culture because they thought they might go back, until finally at some point, I think it might have been around when he was like 15 or so, his father turned down a job to go back and I think teach at a university in Tokyo. He had a very uniquely Japanese upbringing in the UK, and he feels that formed his perspective, gave him a unique perspective of who he was. And he feels sort of culturally bonded to Japan, even though he himself didn't go back there for 30 years. After growing up, he went to college, got his bachelor's degrees in English and philosophy, and eventually got a master's in creative writing. At some point, he took a gap year and sort of traveled the U.S. and Canada. He had some musical aspirations, and he was trying to give out his demo to A&R reps, and I think eventually they just told him, it's not going to happen. But I think that was probably formative to him to just kind of travel around and do that. And then eventually he got back into, or that's when he decided to pursue writing. Although musically he did co-write some songs with some jazz singer Stacey Kent. I think he's very into music. He's a big fan of Bob Dylan. He's also a big fan of movies as well. And he likes that movies have a lot of metaphors. And he, I think, tries to bring that to his own storytelling. His first early jobs was as a social worker. Well, his wife is actually a social worker, and he worked in housing relocation with her until he became a full-time writer. As a writer, he has not been super prolific. He's had about, I think, 8 novels so far. So he kind of just tends to not just put out novels just to put them out. He puts them out when he feels like he's got something to say. But he's been very, very successful critically. As far as for his novels, he won the prestigious Man Booker Prize, which is given out to best original novels in the English language and published in the UK. I think they've widened the category since they originally created that prize. But he was also included on the Granta list in 1983 for the 20 best young British novelists under 40, and I think he was 29 years old at the time. Time magazine named this novel, Never Let Me Go, best novel when it came out, and he has an OBE. And also, he's won the Nobel Prize in Literature. And there's a quote from the Swedish Academy that praised his work. And I wanted to say the quote because I saw it all over the internet, and I thought it's kind of relevant to the discussion about the book, about this particular book. So the quote from the Swedish Academy, when they were giving him the Nobel Prize, they said, "In novels of great emotional force, he has uncovered the abyss beneath our illusory sense of connection with the world." So that I found that quote on the Literature of British Council website. So, I mean, that's kind of Kazuo in a nutshell. I don't know if you guys have anything else to add about him as a person before we get into the discussion about the book. If there's anything else that you guys picked up about him that you thought I kind of missed or glossed over. Margaret?
Well, I think thematically he seems to integrate a lot of his experiences from his own personal life into kind of transfers them into metaphors throughout his work. Mm-hmm. So that's something that I found poignant.
Yeah, I think that's been pointed out in a lot of the critical essays and stuff about him. Yeah, that's certainly part of him. Yeah.
I don't really have a lot of things to say about the author. I usually just enjoy the reading for itself and not try to get into like the specifics of the personal life of the author. But from what you're telling me, he sounds like he's had a pretty interesting upbringing. And one of the things that I thought about when you said he was planning to go back to his place of where he was born,
Japan.
I find it interesting that he longed for that, and I don't know if there's any parallel with Kathy in terms of her longing to be in a place where she can feel secure and familiar with her environment. But maybe there's some parallels there. Maybe I'm just like making things
I think
up.
I think that's what Margaret's saying, and we can get into that when we talk about the book, and maybe we should just go into that. So look,
I think that's a great point, because that's something that I thought about in quite a bit of detail, and so far as, kind of the idea of him having an expectation in his mind, perhaps as a young child, to go back to his land of origin,
his homeland,
and then not having that. So there's a hopefulness within this, Kazuo as an individual, and I think that parallels in a few different ways within the characters. So I think it'd be interesting to get into that.
Yeah, definitely. So well, why don't we just get right into the book then? Let me, I don't know if we can, let me see if I can come up with a quick summary of it to kind of set the stage. All right. So the synopsis for the book, Never Let Me Go, so I'll just try to sum up as best I can. It's about 3 children, Kathy, Ruth, and Tommy. Kathy's the main character, and the story's told from her perspective. It covers their period living in, what's the term? It's like a boarding house, a boarding school. So they're spending their youth. You spend a good majority of the book of their youth and their relationships and kind of growing up in this special boarding school. And you get the sense that something weird is going on, but you don't quite know what it is. And then eventually they go and they sort of graduate from that place and they move on to some cottage. They spend some time there, and then they go on to their adult life. And it's gradually revealed that actually they're clones. They're each clones, and their lives, they've been created to donate their organs for other people on the planet, which they don't really get into who those other people are, but that's the sort of science fiction aspect of this story. But the most of the narrative is focused upon their relationships and what they do with their time in their lives. So I don't know if that kind of sums it up fairly well, but that's sort of the gist of the story. But let me get into you want something to add to that as far as synopsis?
Well, kind of how I understood things, to sum it up, would be the importance of the human condition and how it's correlated with the relevance of time. So the motivation behind behavior, the value in relationships and in experiences as opposed to tangible, aspects or things of the world. And so I think there was a strong resonation in terms of time, and
I think what you're getting at is the story, there's a sense that time is running out.
Right, but it's also the sense of kind of how people understand and develop in the world. So as children, children don't necessarily have a conceptualization of time as they become adolescents, grow into themselves, and then become aware that they're not impervious to the world, or so to speak. So it's kind of like, as people grow, they learn that there's life, there's death, there's here, there's now, there's
when does the ways of the world get revealed to them? That's another aspect. There's an interview I saw somewhere where Kazuo was talking about, he had the idea for the story for a long time. But the premise of the story was just some kids in a boarding school, but he didn't know what to do with it. And then he read something about like genetic engineering or something like that. And then it clicked for him, and he's like, oh, okay, this story that I've been stuck on for a while, I can now write it because I know they're going to be clones. And that gave him the impetus to complete the story and tell it. So the story is sci-fi in that sense, but it's also, it's not very sci-fi. It's sort of soft sci-fi because it doesn't get very into the mechanics of the world. It's actually set in a sort of alternate, parallel world from our own, because it's sort of set in like it's almost like set in like the 90s or something like that. It's sort of set in the past, but it's a different past than our own past. So there's not like technology and all kinds of stuff going on, even though we're dealing with clones. Because he himself, the author, Kazuo, said he wanted to focus more, I think, on like the relationships and people and dealing with this situation of these characters, like how are they going to live their lives knowing that they've been built for this purpose?
That's exactly kind of what
you're getting at.
Right, because this doesn't really strike me as a sci-fi story or book or theme. The cloning aspect, right? I think that's as far as it really went in my mind.
It's very downplayed.
I agree with you.
And then in terms of it being classified as a horror, that was also, I suppose it's horrific to understand or to know that you're going to be harvested for your organs, or
right.
the only purpose of your life is X, Y, and Z.
Yeah.
But other than that, I think this was more of it's kind of like a spiritual journey for this author in a way, because he's touching into themes of the reality of life, of the impermanence of life, but also of the constructs that we all as human beings have to abide by, the laws and the rules and the guidelines of whether or not we like them, or whether we like them or not. And so kind of impermanence, and he seemed intrigued by developing these characters. Mm-hmm. But I know what you're talking about in terms of he first initially developed all the characters in the school, and then didn't know what to do with that, kind of put it on hold. I don't know how many years were in between that, but then was re-inspired by the idea of, okay, I kind of dipped my finger in the biomedical, world. Not really my thing, don't like it, but I'm going to take this one aspect of it. And then he was able to integrate all the parts. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Let me ask Dan. Dan, we're talking about this cloning aspect, and I feel like as far as this book's concerned, that's a very slow reveal. Yeah. How did you feel about that? About the science fiction aspect of it like that?
Yeah, I think I have a lot of strong feelings. I think one of my major issues with the book is that it is a very slow reveal, and once there is a reveal, you don't tell too much. For a long time,
this is not like The Martian.
No, it's not. Like you're really with The Martian. You know what's going on. You're waiting for the next adventure. But in this book, I felt like he was just talking about the relationships continually. He doesn't speak much about the science, about how they got there.
You don't understand how this world really works.
No.
A world where clones are just harvested for their organs, and that's their only purpose.
Right.
It's talked about just a little bit.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the main issues I have. I mean, the relationships were interesting, but at least in my opinion, they were a little basic. You had two women who were interested in a guy, and there was a love triangle of sorts, and
sort of coming age love triangles.
Coming of age, and it was nuanced by the fact that they were in this school where there was, they were living life for a specific purpose, but that wasn't really explained a lot. So I think
they're sheltered. The kids are sort of sheltered in this school.
Yeah, and maybe that was his point.
Yeah.
The interesting thing is, what, for lack of a better word, irked you about the slow development is what I appreciated most, or I found most intriguing by this entire, book, in essence, because there seem to be so many that wasn't important to him, but it
wasn't important to Kazuo.
Is how I understood it, and I think he didn't care.
He focused on the relationships, which are sort of universal for people to relate to.
But it seems like there was yes, absolutely.
And he's almost talking about, and I think he said this, by having the kids in a boarding school, that is sort of symbolic or a metaphor for childhood, how children are protected. And these children are so protected, they're told they're clones, but they're sort of not told, like they don't even quite understand it.
Right.
Then they eventually graduate and they go off to these cottages, which it's almost like teenagers or like your college life, where they're just kind of sitting and waiting before they enter the real world, where the reality of their situation comes full board to hit them, that now they're going to be harvested for organs.
And then they have to make there are then decisions that have to be made, and roles that have to be played, and identities that have to be formulated, and then they have to own it. So I think it's hard to understand why fully this is categorized as a sci-fi or horror or, I'm not sure if I'm even using the right
I don't know if
terminology.
as far as categorizing it, I don't know where it comes, if you went to a bookstore where you'd find this, because I got mine online, but I think to me, this book, it's hard to categorize. It's got literary aspects, it's got science fiction aspects, it's got horror aspects. Like you said, I mean, the horror, it's not a true horror book in that you don't have these like horrifying scenes, but it's like if you read the text, if you read the subtext, of what's being said, when you realize these children are eventually going to grow up and their organs are going to be harvested, and at some point they're going to be maybe in a vegetable state and just existing like that just to have their organs harvested. I mean, that's horrifying. It's like, how could this society even exist? But Kazuo, the author, he never gets into explaining that.
That's what I'm saying. That is horrifying, but why doesn't the author talk about that?
Yeah, and why don't the kids just run? Like, I kept thinking, why don't they just run away? Like, how can they just...
Because they were... this sounds like a passion project for this type... This is the first book I've read by this author, but the way that this kind of developed, and my understanding of it is that Kazuo seemed very much interested in the metaphor. I see that all over the place. So how do they not escape, right? So they... there's an instance in the beginning where they're told a story about,
don't go in the woods because then bad things will happen, essentially.
Your body parts will be dismembered, etc.
Something.
And so therefore...
They're sort of indoctrinated to this life.
Right. So think about our lives, or human beings. Like, there are things and rules that we're all told and taught that we have to abide by for our own protection
and we just accept
survival.
them.
Right. And then as they get into adolescence, they start to question them. They had two friends.
Or some people do and some people don't.
That's actually a very good point. And I think this book it's almost kind of feels like a template for, or an outline for so many more avenues it could be taken in.
Yeah, I mean, I think what you're saying is that there is a big backstory behind the relationship between this love triangle. Honestly, I felt like this story was more about a love triangle than a parallel universe with clones and the emotional processes that you go through with understanding that you don't have a parent. Your life, you can't become anything, and
you can't reproduce.
Right. They've talked about that.
Yeah.
You can't. Well, you're not supposed to be able to be intimate with other people, and it's just kind of like there's a big backstory.
Well, the characters are intimate with each other.
Right. But I'm saying you're not supposed to.
I didn't feel that. I thought they could. I thought they could have relationships, but
they said that they couldn't
reproduce.
But we don't know for sure whether or not that's because clones couldn't biologically reproduce, or
I thought they couldn't biologically produce, but that actually brings me to
know that?
One of the, I think Kazuo even pointed this out, like, these characters, they have these clones, they have their own mythology. So part of the narrative is, let's talk about the character of Madame. Madame is like sort of like the principal of the school, I guess. She's not one of the teachers. She just comes on periodically. The kids are all encouraged to make artwork. And they don't really know why, but periodically Madame comes and collects their artwork, and they all think it's going to be made part of this gallery. So a sort of mythology arises that there's a significance to her wanting to collect your artwork. And we don't find out till later what's going on with that. It's given importance in the story because one of the characters, Tommy, the love interest, I guess, of the two girls, Ruth and Kathy, can't produce art, and he's frustrated. But eventually he's told by one of the teachers that it's okay that he can't produce art, and he'll be an okay person. Later on, when they graduate, he turns around on this because this myth has arisen by students outside their particular school saying that if some clones, a pair of clones who are in a relationship, can prove that they are truly in love, then they can get a quote-unquote deferral and not have to go and have their organs harvested. They won't have to quote-unquote donate. And so these two older students tell our main characters, because they think our main characters know about this, I guess, loophole, saying, hey, if we prove our true love to someone, can we get a deferral and not have to have our organs harvested? And our main characters, who are kind of in the dark, and as readers, we're also in the dark. We don't know, but we kind of know that our main characters don't know what they're talking about.
But they tried to find out.
And eventually they try to find out. Mm-hmm. And it's eventually revealed that there is no deferral, that it is just a mythology. And I think that's kind of what you're getting at, Margaret, in that sense that this book is sort of very true to life, in that we as people, as humans, make up our own mythologies of trying to extend our life in some way. and we pursue these myths and stuff. So the story is not a typical like genre science fiction story where the characters find out they're cloned and find out that their organs are going to be harvested, and now we're going to spend the rest of the narrative of them trying to escape or defeat the oppressive overlords who have instituted the system. It gets into none of that. It's just more tragic, sort of somber resignation that this is the way things are, and how are we going to live our life?
And it's also kind of thematically, Dan, what do you think about this? It's about finding beauty in
temporary nature of life, or
impermanence.
Impermanence, yeah.
And everything and anything, and the way that constructs are formed in our society in terms of... So in my mind, I kept thinking, well, what's the value of the art production? What is this going to mean? What does it do? Why are they doing it?
Right. And the students don't know what the art's performed, and then eventually they pursue it to the end to find out what was this madame doing with the artwork, and they find out, well, she was just taking it and just hanging on to it, and there's nothing really to it. And
why do you think that?
And is that just a metaphor for our own life? Like, why do we as humans create art? Why does Kazuo Ishiguro write a book? To provide meaning to our lives. And I think that's what these clones are sort of doing.
And it's kind
of course they're not doing it. Of course they don't know why they're doing it.
No, but that's what keeps them going and waking up every day and doing what they need to do. Because if they knew the reality of their fate, they needed to figure out a way to cope. And if they couldn't cope, then what would be the purpose? What would be the motivation behind the behavior?
I don't know. I think I saw a little different. I thought the whole fact of them being creative and creating art was more of a benefit to these progressive activists with their guardians, their teachers, obviously obviously for the audience, they're trying to show that these people have a soul.
Oh, yeah, right.
That they're human beings, and that's why they had them do these creative projects so they could show...
That's true. That's why they were collecting art, because they wanted to show the outside world these clones are actual people.
Right. So to me, it didn't seem so much of a comment on what they were experiencing, but more of a literary device to say this is what Hail Shim went through, because they wanted to show that this was a special school and that they are humans, they have thoughts, they have feelings. I didn't see it as an explanation of what they were going through and some kind of statement on the human condition. It just seemed like almost like a literary device to show these guys are humans, they have a soul, and they can express their feelings.
Well, that's certainly what Madame says, but I guess I'm saying is the fact that the author put this in there, it's almost like allegorical or metaphorical to
hope,
our own life. And like, we as humans, why do we do these things? Sometimes like these characters are doing it because they're told to do it, but they're also doing it eventually, like Tommy does the artwork because he goes further and thinks that this is going to help them get this deferral, this chance for freedom. Although then they get the rug pulled out from under them and find out there is no deferrals.
Right. So
let me ask you: was that moment horrifying to you guys when Madame reveals that there is no deferrals and there's no way out, and then they're just going to have to accept that this is who they are?
I don't know. I thought there wasn't a deferral law. It just seemed
you never thought there was.
No,
you always thought they were chasing a myth.
Yeah. I didn't really see it any other way. I guess I didn't see like a storybook ending where they would get a deferral and they would be able to be with each other for the next 4 to 5 years. Because I don't think it was like a permanent deferral. It was like a temporary thing. So I just thought they were going to be disappointed in the end. And because throughout the story, Ruth agreed with these things that she didn't really know about, and there was a lot of gossip and stories that were made up. So I thought, well, maybe this was another one to give them hope, because hope was a big theme throughout the book about how do you cope in circumstances where ostensibly there isn't hope, but you have to create certain hope for yourself to be able to live life and be get up every morning. I mean, how do you create that hope when eventually you're just going to be, your organ's going to be harvested. And that's really all you can do.
I think, Margaret, this goes back to what you were saying in the beginning, is the author, his own upbringing, growing up in Japan, and for his early life, thinking it was only temporary. and he was going to have to move.
Right. Well, I think in knowing what happened in Japan at that time, and his own mother, was
The survivor of the atomic bomb dropping.
Right.
Yeah.
And so I think overall, I looked at it as if, it's horrifying in a way. However, it's kind of like welcome to reality. It was like a truth was revealed. And I think the purpose of Madame and, the adult characters in the story who tried to perpetuate this idea that the art had some deeper meaning or some deeper purpose or something else to it, was a facade that they created as adults to protect the children from the reality of what they were and what their lives were going to be and become. And in holding that art or collecting that art or kind of creating that charade, so to speak, if that makes sense,
sure.
Madame first comes off as a character as kind of distant, afraid.
She's literally afraid of the clones.
Detached. But as the story progresses, you start to understand, or at least from my perspective, start to believe or feel that there's something deeper there, that she's doing these things, and these things are created to protect them, but also because she cares. And because
Madame makes the point, Madame and the other guardian who's living with her, that Helsham is supposed to be different. That there's other schools where clones are, but they're not treated as well. And that Helsham was supposed to be an experiment to show the world that the clones were better. But ultimately it fails because Helsham is closed by the end of the book, right?
Because the bottom line is that...
since the beginning, actually, because it's told past tense.
True. So Madame, everyone else, they were trying to probably create make the children feel special, think they're special, etc. To do something for them that's not done in other places, but ultimately knew that there was a higher level above them that they could not break through. So they created this for their school. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. What about Tommy? He's an interesting character. He struggles in the beginning. He has these fits. He has these outrages. He's frustrated because he's not artistic. He's the love interest of Kathy and Ruth. And Ruth dates him first for many years. And ultimately becomes a big point in the book that Kathy always liked him, is probably a better fit for him. But for some reason, Ruth, maybe because Kathy likes Tommy, Ruth just decides to be with him. And eventually...
Well, that's interesting.
That's what much of the story is about about this kind of triangle. And Kathy is sort of a big supporter of Ruth and just kind of goes along with whatever Ruth wants until the point where she's frustrated and decides, I'm going to move on with my life. And goes into, I guess, adulthood and goes into the donation carer stage. And Kathy becomes a carer. She cares for the donors. And then Ruth and Tommy become donors. And then it all comes full circle when they get back together, and Ruth and Tommy are now in their donation phase, and Ruth asks for forgiveness for keeping them separate, and Kathy and Tommy get back together. But the character of Tommy is interesting in his rages and stuff, and also the little things he does, and he almost seems a little bit behind as far as development in their characters.
That's interesting that you say that because the thing we don't know is who these characters are clones of. So there isn't a qualifier necessarily for, intelligence for this school or artistic ability or, whatever. There's an idea that it's about the art, but it's not, we don't talk. They don't talk about entrance exams or anything like that or qualifiers.
Yeah.
So
right.
we're these all the characters are. We don't know where they're at on that level of intelligence, understanding, communication,
right.
etc. And
then all we know is all they want is their organs. So
right. So Tommy is kind of the classic. He's temperamental. He's irritable. He's explosive. He's kind of the walking, trigger point for things.
But he's also sweet.
Right. But predominantly with Kathy.
Right.
And he's aware of himself. Well, I would be curious to know what you guys think about the elephant piece of artwork that Tommy created.
The drawings?
Yeah, the kind of the change when he transitioned from one to another. I think Do you know what?
Yeah, he's doing drawings, and at some point the other students are progressing and making more advanced drawings, and he can't. He's doing sort of simple drawings, and he gets made fun of, and that's when he gets very frustrated until I think the teacher Lucy, who is the only teacher that wants to tell the kids the truth, and she eventually gets fired for that. And then, so Tommy, I think he's making like an elephant drawing. And then later on, he pursues drawing on his own, and he makes more intricate drawings in its own unique way.
But then he hides it.
And he hides it.
Because so the only thing he presents to the other children is described as childlike drawings. Yeah. So it's almost like he has...
Well, doesn't he, like, no, he hides it, I guess, yeah.
I always wonder, like, is there a point to, like, Tommy's... like what he goes through as
I think so. Like, I really felt
what he goes through as well.
His rages.
Like he goes from rages to like not having rages, having friends, and then like not being a good artist, and then like being very dedicated to it when he's in the cottages. Like, I guess I'm trying to understand what
he's like the wolf. He's the external, he's
Tommy to me is. He is the emotional release that the story needed, as far as the exact situation of what the clones are in. The outrage of their existence. When you realize that these are just people and having their organs harvested. I mean, it's a horror show, but it's all tempered, and the clones are all accepting. The characters all accepting it, but it all comes to a head when finally Tommy and Kathy go talk to Madame. Because they want to get this deferral, and Tommy's all about it, and he's put in all these years of hard work trying to become an artist, and then he finds out it's all for naught. And after years of not having rages and gotten over it, he finally has one final rage where him and Kathy are driving back, and he has to sort of stop the car, and then he runs out into a field and just starts screaming. And I thought that was a very strong scene. Because I was like, yes, that is the emotion I'm feeling when I read this. Like, it's the futility. Like, he's realizing the futility of their existence. And he's the only one that sort of just like kind of like lets loose. Like this, like he finds out the absurdity of it all. And he just rages against the night in his impotence that he can't do anything about it.
Because it goes against everything that seems to be natural to him as just who he is as a human being. And I think that's proof in of itself that the clones have emotions, they have feelings, they have depth, they have, ideas, and he is one that isn't easily suppressed in a society or in a construct that requires suppression in a way. And he can't deal with his reality. And Kathy's kind of the stable guiding line along the way. She's a bit more passive.
Well, they all deal with their reality better than Tommy does in theory. But yet, Tommy, it almost seems like when you realize the reality of what's going on with him, he almost seems more rational. Because why wouldn't they rage against the reality of their situation? Dan, it sounds like you were going to say something.
Yeah, no, I was just going to say, I think you're right. I think Tommy is more of the natural reaction to his situation. He just doesn't necessarily, like you said, rage against, but he definitely has honest reactions to a situation, where you have Kathy, who suppresses feelings and is very practical about a situation and tries to make everything okay. And then you have Ruth, who fantasizes everything, and she's hopeful about these things that she knows she can never have, and she tries to just fit in everywhere she goes.
She's always trying to fit in.
Yeah, so I think you're right. I guess I didn't think about that Tommy is more of like a person who has natural reactions to his environment, and it is what it is. And I think that,
and yet he comes off as awkward in the beginning and out of place socially.
Yeah.
But when you look at his whole arc, you realize, like, well, his rages make sense, or certainly at the end it makes sense, more so than anyone else's reaction.
It's probably the most pure reaction.
The most honest,
Because Ruth from the beginning was always trying to orchestrate things, orchestrate people, manipulate situations, be the ringleader.
Is she a bad character? Is she a bad character? Is she like a bad person?
No, I don't see her as bad. I see her as insecure and complex, where she'll integrate. How do I answer that?
What do you think, Dan? Do you think Ruth is a bad person because she's always trying to manipulate people and she'll literally make stuff up even if she doesn't know the answer?
I don't know. I think if you take it in terms of like the main character of the story, I think she's supposed to be like the manipulator, but for whatever reason, Kathy still finds her to be a good friend, which is kind of like a theme throughout the book. Like, she really treats Kathy in a very unfriendly way.
Yeah.
Somebody you wouldn't treat a friend that way, the way things she does to her, but Kathy seems to just keep coming back to it and not be terribly affected by it.
Yeah.
So I think she's supposed to be that, but in the end, obviously she comes around full circle and she
wants redemption from
when she's going through the donations at the end, when she realizes, this is the end for me, maybe I should make peace with the people who have been in my life.
Yeah.
Kathy's like the quiet grace that overarches the entire. You could see her as passive or as
she's like the everyman. She's like the Jerry Seinfeld of the group.
A bit. She seems to have a higher level of understanding of the bigger picture of things, in the sense that she is okay. She's okay with what is. She's probably intelligent enough to do what she needs to do to be a caregiver for an extended period of time, but she doesn't seem to have as wide of a range of emotions as the other two.
Yeah.
She seems to be more consistent throughout, whereas Ruth is up and down. But Ruth, it's all about them, forming their own identities within, it's kind of a coming of age story in a lot of ways.
It's definitely a part of the narrative, yeah.
Truth seems to be a very big theme. So with Ruth, truth and Ruth, with Ruth making up things or making realities the way she wanted them to be, Kathy kept the reader in a straight line, to understand the truth slowly. And Tommy was the exciting interjection of, he's like the fireball. He's like the atomic bomb that got dropped in Nagasaki. Too far.
He's definitely interesting. I mean, you start off the book, I believe, with him throwing like a rage, and it did draw me in. I mean, that's the most interesting that happens.
But Kathy was always the one that saw that there was more to him.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So people seemed to think that each of them were one way or another. But Kathy, for some reason, could see through all of that and saw, there was one point where Tommy slapped her in the face,
right,
correct?
Yeah.
And so, but she forgave him.
Yeah.
And so if it were hypothetically him doing that to Ruth, I think they probably would have brawled it out, right?
Yeah, maybe. Ruth would have probably analyzed who saw it and what they were thinking of it.
And what she could do with that.
Yeah.
And how she could spin it. And whereas Kathy could see that he was both an angry, raging type, but also a sweet, very sensitive boy turning, teenager man in the end.
Yeah. It's very much a story, a temporal story about the futility of life, and I think there's a term, it's a Japanese term translated as mano no aware. Let me see if my notes, I had it written down.
Mano no aware. Yeah.
Mano no aware. And
the pathos of things, or an empathy toward things, or a sensitivity to ephemera.
And I had another note saying it's confronting the unresolved path with melancholic resignation. That was from Wikipedia. And these characters very much are just sort of like, kind of, their whole narrative is confronting the reality of their situation. And that's what this book is about. It's not about the fact that they're clones, or the science behind that, or the world that's around them. It's about people living their lives, and there's this like kind of tragedy to their life, but yet what are they going to do? How are they going to make the most of it?
But isn't it about, I exactly agree with you. It's about the awareness of when children learn that about life and death, right?
When children wake up to the reality of the world.
As humans develop become adults,
That's certainly in this, the coming age of aspect. It's certainly, like I said, the boarding school to the cottages to the residences where they become donors, and how they just are slowly brought into the reality of their lives.
Yeah. I think one of the themes that seemed to stick out to me, and probably to everybody, is why didn't they do anything about their situation?
Yeah, they don't run away. The story is now they never fight the oppression. They never do, they take no steps to change
or even talk about it.
A little bit.
They take steps, and they want to try to get deferrals or whatever.
Right, but then
but they're not like
in the beginning, though. As children, they were told stories of if you go past a certain line into the woods, you get your dismembered.
But when they're living at the cottages, they're allowed to go to the city, and they take independent trips to the city, and they can. It seems like they can. It does seem like they're sort of under a yoke at that point. Like, it doesn't seem like they kind of feel they can't just leave. Like they got to come back.
And they also saw that the other two characters that were their friends that were older,
Rodney and Chrissy or something, or
they discussed an escape, and I think they came to the resolution that there wasn't another option. Also, if you think about it, where were they to go? They don't,
Yeah. You get the sense when they go out in the wild world,
their family was Hillshire.
Yeah, they have no family to go to, no other support system. But you also get the sense that that people will sort of recognize them for who they are, because they don't know how to act in the world. I mean, when they go to order food or whatever, like, they're awkward about it. Like and also people almost like look at them askew, like they realize they're clones, and it's like people are so, like, subconsciously realizing the horror of that. Like people don't want to see them because it reminds them of the horrific society that exists where clones are raised to have their organs harvested.
But they did, interestingly, they tried to find, they saw a woman, was it a woman who looked like...
Yeah, Possible?
Possible, yeah.
Possible, yes, yes.
Yeah, for Ruth. Yeah, the two older students say that they think there's a possible. Yeah, well, we can probably wrap this up and then get into anything else in the movie episode that we haven't covered now. Why don't we just go around the horn, and we'll just all give our rating and any final comments you have about the book. So we'll just say, out of 5 stars, how many stars would you give it? And, any final comment you got. When do you want to start with you, Dan? So out of 5 stars, how many would you give this book?
I would probably give it... This is a tough one, because I've read Hunger Games, I've read Divergent, and these are dystopian novels about people who don't accept the status quo. Mm-hmm. And they do everything they can to have a personal freedom, which they don't have in these worlds. So I actually...
Those are much more action-based. Those are sort of coming-age stories, and...
They're similar. I mean, there's a lot of coming-of-age aspects to it. There's romantic elements, but... Mm-hmm. And I think I approached this book waiting for that. Mm-hmm. So I think that assumption made it a little difficult to process the book. But I think in hindsight, I appreciate that it was a dystopian world. However, the author was trying to show us a different side to that dystopian world. Mm-hmm. He was trying to show us the mundane, the banal, the everyday life, to what it feels like to live in this world and not have this huge...
not being part of some kind of revolution. Yeah.
Yeah. And, I appreciate that. So I give it 3 stars.
Okay, interesting. Margaret, what about you?
I think overall it spoke to the constructs of realizing one's fate and accepting one's fate. And like you said, Dan, there wasn't much of an opposition or a push or a fight. There was kind of I think the melancholic resoluteness. I found this to be slightly depressing, in all honesty.
Oh yeah.
And throughout, it didn't really. There's no shockers. There weren't many aspects of that. So, I think it was more of a metaphor for reality as it is. There are things we can control. There are things the characters can't, but these characters have decided to accept it for whatever reason. And so to give it a numerical value, I would say 3.85.
3.85. Okay, that might be a first. I'd have to check some of the old records with Wilk. 3.85. Okay, fair enough. So for me, I think I'm gonna upgrade my rating, and I might give this I'm gonna give this a 4.5 star. I feel like I really liked this book, but it's not perfect because I did what Dan is saying. I felt like it was slow, and I kind of was waiting for some things to happen. That being said, after I finished the book and after I came to the end, and even since I put the book down, I felt like the book stuck with me. And I've been thinking about the book ever since. And I think it more and more that it resonated with me, and it is sort of like a metaphor about life. And it is really just make me just reflect about life and the impermanence of life and the temporal nature of life and the futility of life and why we do things and how we just try to find meaning and purpose in life. And this book stuck with me a lot more than some like those other books that you mentioned, Dan, as far as in that way. And so I give it a 4.5 stars with a caution that I don't think it's perfect, and I do think it is slow. It's a slow read, but it's not a long book either. So you're not really going through 1,000 pages or whatever to slog through this. It's a fairly fairly quick read as far as that goes. So yeah, that's what I think of it. So that being said, is there anything that you guys want to plug on the web? Dan, do you want to plug anything? I know you were not sure about that. I'm trying to push you to plug something. Dan's also a musician. I think we mentioned in our previous show that some of his past musical projects, we've had links to those. Those are probably still on the web on Bandcamp maybe or something like that, or...
Yeah, I think there is a Bandcamp. Unfortunately, I can't remember the Bandcamp. But if you like the indie pop scene, feel free to log in. I think I can't really remember the Facebook. It's facebook.com, obviously, / Cicero, Sisero.
As an old musical project of yours?
Yes, and most well-known, I guess.
Okay.
Well,
all right. Yeah. Dan's a musician. You sing and play guitar?
I do.
Okay. And Margaret, what about you? Anything you want to plug or anything? Or any favorite shows or anything you want to talk about? Or
if anyone needs any psychological consultation, let me know.
Okay, this is not a plug for your business, Margaret.
I'm kidding. No, I truly appreciate kind of the majesty of the artistry that this author took complex issues in knowing his roots and his perspective, and I think he took a chance in a genre that you wouldn't probably associate his work with, and I think he owned it, and I appreciate that.
Fair enough. That's a plug for this book. All right, so we would ask anyone to write reviews and rate us on Apple Podcasts. We're also on TuneIn Radio, and the podcast is on YouTube and Stitcher and Google Play and just pretty much everywhere else you can get podcasts. The website for the podcast is, of course, www.nodeodorant.com. And that's about it. Tune in for our next episode when we talk about the movie for Never Let Me Go. Till then, we will all say good night.
Good night.
Good night.
Good night, everyone.
For more information on the topics discussed in this episode, or to read our show notes and find us on social media, visit nodeodorant.com. For more information on Ryan Sean O'Reilly and his various works of fiction, visit ryanseanoreilly.com. The theme music for this podcast was written by John Doyle from the band I Decline. You can visit him at i-decline.com. Voiceover for this podcast was provided by me, Margret O'Reilly. Well, that concludes our episode. We hope you've learned a lot. Again, thanks for listening to our show. And always, always remember, there is no deodorant in outer space.
I gotta consolidate these and make these a little quicker, a little dead air here. The book came out.
Well, he can edit it. So.
Are we allowed to pause and redo?
We can pause and redo, but I don't think we need to.
You're good, Margaret. You're good.
Yeah. Okay, so the book is essentially about 3 characters. It's 3 children, Kathy, Ruth, and Tommy. It's told all from Kathy's perspective, and they go to. Do you want to take a break?
Sorry, can I grab my phone?
Yeah, go ahead.
Sorry.
This is life, Margaret. This is ruining everything.
No, go ahead.
Ryan's fans are like really upset about this.
This is for the blooper reel.
Oh, there you go. There's your Aunt Wheel.
Perfect.
Sorry about that. I'm back. The importance of the communication. I'm sorry. Scratch that.